Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. 48 million people in West and Central Africa face acute food insecurity in the coming months. A 10-year high spurred by insecurity, climate shocks, COVID-19 and high prices, United Nations humanitarian agencies have warned. West and Central Africa have faced increasing risks caused by higher temperatures and erratic rainfall. War in Ukraine has contributed to food and fertilizer shortages in one of the world's poorest regions. Unfortunately, the trends in weather patterns may continue until the 2060s independently of our success in climate mitigation. That's according to the World Meteorological Organization. Droughts, floods, and heat waves affected communities on every continent and cost many billions of dollars as climate change continued its advance in 2022. This is one of the key findings of the annual flagship report, The State of the Global Climate. We'll have a look at this and more today on the program. Do stay with us. The COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and conflicts have created significant food security challenges worldwide in the past years. Currently, millions of people around the world need urgent support in over 45 countries. Western African countries are daily facing these risks, millions going hungry daily, says the World Food Programme.
The food security situation is so poor. Those people have lost everything behind them, that is livestock or agriculture, and they came completely in need of food, shelter, water, health care, everything they want. Majority of them are women and children, as we have seen today in Iftin IDP.
The number of people without regular access to safe and nutritious food is projected to hit 48 million during the June-August lean season. That's according to a regional food security analysis presented by the United Nations World Food Programme, Humanitarian Agency, OCHA, Food and Agriculture Organization, and Children's Agency, UNICEF. That is driven in part by the plight of countries in the semi-arid Sahel region, south of the Sahara Desert, including Mali and Burkina Faso, which are battling an Islamist insurgency that has killed thousands and displaced around 2.5 million. A record 45,000 people in the Sahel are expecting to face catastrophic hunger, a level just short of famine, according to the agencies. Fighting has cut off food supply routes in parts of the Sahel and other conflict hotspots around Lake Chad and the Central African Republic. Overall, the World Food Programme faces a $900 million deficit this year in the region. The forecast food shortages mean around 16.5 million children under 5 face acute malnutrition this year. This region's dependence on imports has made it vulnerable to high global inflation rates, even though many parts of West Africa saw improved rainfall in 2022 and an increase in cereal production. But just providing food aid isn't enough to tackle the growing hunger crisis, explained Wayne Paulson of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations.
Probably one of the most visible changes, quite frankly, is the explosion, the mushrooming, the growth in the number of people in need of urgent assistance. The global humanitarian overview, that's a joint appeal coordinated by the United Nations together with partners. The Food and Agriculture Organization is part of it. Launched at the end of last year an appeal to support some 230 million people. I mean, these numbers, quite frankly, are eye-watering. And it tells us that we need to do not just more, but we need to do it better.
Ahead of a flagship United Nations Hunger Report to be launched in May, the FAO discussed critical concerns within the global humanitarian landscape and highlights the importance of proactive measures and investment that support local food production and enhance the resilience of agriculture in hunger hotspots.
Fundamentally, it's about putting resources in the hands of affected farming families. This means, for example, seeds, tools, technical assistance to allow them to plant for a coming season. It means keeping animals alive during a drought period or during a winter, and we do that through provision of emergency animal feed, even medical assistance, veterinary assistance to animals to keep these precious assets alive. Often it's also about just putting cash in the hands of people. I mean, if you or I are affected by a disaster, we know best how to respond to our immediate need. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in the Horn of Africa is an example of early warning analysis and anticipatory action calls going really unheeded. FAO and other partners in the UN system back in late 2021 were calling for a scaled-up response because we saw that rains were failing and indeed that communities and vulnerable households were under stress. So even back then we were saying there needs to be a scaled-up response. We had the tragic experiences of 2017-18 and earlier drought events as well, hard-won experiences there that told us that we needed to work differently. Again, Somalia is a really good example of where a time-sensitive agricultural intervention would enable a family to have to be able to stay on their land, to not be forced to displace to a camp outside of an urban setting. Our experience in Somalia and elsewhere tells us that if people's animals are still alive, if they have crops in the ground, if they've been able to plant seeds, if there are things to tend, more often than not, they will not be forced to flee elsewhere.
In a food crisis context, more than 70% of affected people live in rural communities and rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. However, only 4% of all the humanitarian response funding that goes into those protected emergency settings supports agriculture. The FAO calls for more funding for time-sensitive agricultural assistance in emergencies.
Inside Tigray, in a context where there was conflict unfolding, there was armed conflict taking place, people were still able to grow. And with FAO's support and other partners, at the same time as some 200,000 metric tons of international assistance by other agencies was trucked in, and there were concerns about physical access to communities, during that same period of time, farmers in Tigray, with support from FAO and others, produced 900,000 metric tons of food. So equivalent to 6 to 7 months of the food requirements of that region of the world. So again, the lesson in these spaces is people have a lot more resilience, a lot more ability to cope, perhaps than some of the international narrative gives them credit for. And we're also able, with these time-sensitive interventions, to allow people to provide for themselves, even in the most challenging circumstances. So you have a majority of the population relying on farming, and a minority of the funding to support agricultural response activities. And this just simply doesn't make sense. We have year-on-year humanitarian responses. We also, as FAO, respond after what we call sudden onset events, after, for example, the tragedy that we've seen now of the earthquake in Turkey that's impacting both Turkey and Syria. This is also part of what we do, and it needs a time-sensitive response.
According to the World Meteorological Organization's Secretary General, heat waves in China and Europe affected tens of millions, drove food insecurity, boosted mass migration, and cost billions of dollars in loss and damage.
Last summer, the heat wave here in Europe led to casualties of about 15,000 people who died because of the heat wave and poor air quality. And in China, last summer was the hottest summer ever, and it was also the second driest summer that they have observed. And they also reached a record low level of water in their main river called Yangtze.
Furthermore, the World Meteorological Organization says concentrations of the three main greenhouse gases which trap heat in the atmosphere, that is carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, reached record highs in 2021, which is the latest year for which consolidated data is available, and that there are indications of a continued increase in 2022.
Melting of the glaciers continue, and there has been a 4-time increase of the melting of glaciers since the 70s. And here in Switzerland, we lost 6.2% of the glacier mass last summer because of the heat wave, which is a new record.
And in reality, we have again broken a new record in ocean heat content, which is, for example, giving more energy for tropical storms, cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons, says the World Meteorological Organization in its latest State of the Global Climate Report, released just before Earth Day on the 22nd of April. It reports on climate change indicators such as temperature, ocean heat and acidification, sea level rise, sea ice, glaciers, and extreme weather.
We have doubled the sea level rise during the past 20 years. We used to have 2.3 millimeters per year sea level rise 20 years ago, and recently we have seen 4.6 millimeters per year increases. And that increase is very much coming from the melting of major glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica.
In addition to climate indicators, the report focuses on impacts throughout the year. Hazardous climate and weather-related events drove new population displacement and worsened conditions for many of the 95 million people already living in displacement at the beginning of the year.
We have started seeing the increase of food insecurity again, and there have been more than 20 million people affected in Horn of Africa, 28 million in Latin America and Caribbean, 19 million in Afghanistan, and 7 million in South Sudan.
In Somalia, almost 1.2 million people became internally displaced by the catastrophic impact of drought on pastoral and farming livelihoods and hunger during the year. Record-breaking rainfall in Pakistan in July and August last year killed over 1,700 people, while some 33 million were affected. The report also puts spotlight on ecosystems and the environment and shows how climate change is affecting recurring events in nature, such as when trees blossom or birds migrate.
The governments have realized that there's a problem called climate change, and they can see it with their own eyes, and the proof of scientific facts is now very clear. And what has also been happening during the past years is that the private sector has started acting. So growing amount of big companies worldwide, they are interested in climate mitigation and being part of the solution.
Climate scientists have warned that the world could reach a new average temperature record in 2023 or 2024, fueled by climate change and the anticipated return of warming El Niño conditions. WMO's new figures show that global temperatures have continued to rise, making 2015 to 2022 the 8th warmest ever since regular tracking started in 1850, despite 3 consecutive years of a cooling La Niña climate pattern.
2022 was the second warmest year on record, the warmest summer on record. We saw prolonged and extensive heat waves and also prolonged and extensive drought over much of the continent. We had the highest emissions of carbon from wildfires in a number of countries, and those wildfires were bigger than average. They started earlier than average, and the season persisted longer than average. We also saw record ice melt from glaciers in the European Alps. So climate change isn't a future problem. It is a current problem or a current challenge that we all need to adapt to and live with. So really understanding how we can live with our changing climate is really, really important. So globally, 2022 was the 5th warmest year on record, and the last 8 years have been the 8 warmest years on record. We also know that 2022 was the 3rd year in a row where we experienced La Niña conditions. So it was what's known as a triple dip La Niña, and La Niña suppresses global temperatures. So the anticipation is if we do transition into El Nino, the expectation is that 2023 is more likely to be warmer than 2022. For me, it's really important to stay optimistic and hopeful. So yes, we are currently at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial. And yes, every single country in the world in 2015 committed to the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And so the expectation from scientists, when we look at the numbers and currently being at 1.2 degrees, we're likely to hit 1.5 degrees in the early 2030s. So a decade from now, perhaps less, depending on what happens with our emission scenarios. The reality is, though, that every single fraction of a degree matters. So the choices that people make are incredibly important.
Renewable fuel sources and energy security have taken on a new urgency following the Ukraine war. On their part, G7 ministers have set big new targets for solar power and offshore wind. At the last meeting in Japan, climate and energy ministers agreed to speed up both developing clean energy and phasing out fossil fuels after 2 days of talks in the Japanese city of Sapporo. But they stopped short of agreeing a 2030 deadline to phase out coal, which Canada and other members had pushed for. And they left the door open for continuing to invest in gas, saying it could help ease energy shortfalls. They agreed to accelerate phasing out unabated fossil fuels, that is, the burning of fossil fuels without using technology to capture the resulting carbon dioxide emissions. That will achieve net zero in energy systems by 2050 at the latest.
In the G7 meeting, we acknowledged that different countries around the world have various economic and energy situations, and the path to carbon neutrality by 2050 should be diverse. The important thing is to aim towards net zero, our common goal, and that was recognized.
Their decision is coming at a time when the World Meteorological Organization says improved technology makes the transition to renewable energy cheaper and more accessible than ever.
The thing that we are not doing right is that we are not matching our words and our commitments with enough action. So if you look at that report and also the report that we've produced in the IPCC, we see that many countries in the world have now submitted ambitious nationally determined contribution. Several other countries have announced what they call a net zero target, some by 2050, some by 2060, and a few beyond. But actually what our work shows in the IPCC is that there remains a huge gap between this rhetoric, these targets, these ambitions, and implementation. Some countries are saying, for example, we want to meet net zero by 2060 or by 2050, and they are still investing in more coal-fired power plants, oil and gas pipelines, and that is not just working. So what we need to do is to scale up the investment in order to translate our ambitions into practical action on the ground. And this is actually the same with Nigeria. Nigeria has an ambitious NDC and now also a net zero commitment by 2060 and a national climate change act. But if you ask what are the actions on the ground that is going to get us to this net zero by 2060, the answer is not very promising. We have not done enough to stop gas flaring. We are not planting enough trees. We are not producing enough or investing enough in the production of renewable energy. So all of these things that we're supposed to be doing in order to actually meet our target, we are very, very slow in doing them, both in Nigeria and unfortunately across the world.
Professor Chukwumerije Okereke and his team at the Society for Planet and Prosperity recently released Nigeria's top 10 net zero and economic development measures, which is a report with the aim to map 10 key steps and decisions that, if taken in the next 5 years, will underpin a socio-economic transformation required to enable Nigeria to meet the government's 2060 net zero objective.
We came up with about 35 measures. We did not invent any measure. These are measures that are already in the NDC or in the LTV. LTV means the long-term vision, and NDC means nationally determined contribution. Some of these measures are in the post-COVID recovery plan, the National Economic and Sustainability Plan. Some of these measures are in the midterm National Development Plan. We compiled 35 measures. We then spoke with a lot of intelligent people, stakeholders, sector experts to begin to rank these measures. We are ranking these measures along the lines of which of them will result in massive emission reduction, which of them will also have economic development impact. So because we realize that Nigeria should be taking climate change action, but also doing so in ways that actually grows its economy. That's why we really paid emphasis on the measures that will help us to achieve our climate goals, but also stimulate economic growth and sustainable development, create jobs, for example. One of the provisions that we have in that Climate Change Act is a National Climate Change Fund. Okay, so they now need to be thinking very hard, how can we ensure that this is not an empty eggshell, or that it has real money in it. And I have already indicated in this report some of the things that they need to do. The government really just need to understand how critical this is. They need to supply some, money to the council, get them settled, hire the best kind of people around, and get into elaborating some mechanisms in order to begin to attract international finance.
The report argues for the need for a development-centric approach to climate change action, appealing to decision makers that any government will be judged with its performance against them. The societal acceptance of a climate-aligned transition will similarly be judged against them.
This is one of the main reasons why a lot of companies and countries are not taking action on climate change. There is a wide perception that you cannot do both at the same time. You have to choose either development or you choose action on climate change. Now, that is not the case. Actually, there are several areas where you can do development in a way that actually also solve the climate change problem. And this is why in this report that you referenced, we place emphasis on what we call in the core benefits. That is, what are the actions that you can take on climate change, but also they have development benefits. For example, in Nigeria, we know that generating energy through renewable sources will create more jobs than generating energy through oil and gas. So this is one area where we can actually create more jobs, supply people with greater electricity, and still so take action on climate change in doing so, and still grow our economy. Another example, you can reduce emissions if you go by, bus rapid transport systems or by, train, and that will also mean greater economic activities because you can connect various parts of Nigeria. It will be smooth, it will be easier, it will be faster than traveling on the road, and you will still be reducing emissions massively. A third example is if you were to say, okay, we want to do 5 million green homes in Nigeria. Now, these green homes can use locally manufactured raw materials, banana husks, earth, mud, and etc. And in doing so, the homes will be cooler, they'll be more climate friendly, and then also you'll be reducing emissions and creating jobs in so doing. I can go on and on. Agroforestry is another example. By practicing agroforestry, you enhance your crop production, you increase food security, and you reduce emissions that would have come from slash and burn and unclimate-friendly agricultural practices. What Nigeria really needs is to get the people that understand this, people that are experts, people that know what they are doing, in order to help Nigeria to shape its economic trajectory in a way that actually makes it possible for them to achieve their net zero targets.
At the end of the day, the Society for Planet and Prosperity says its 11 measures, which will have massive socio-economic benefit, while also putting Nigeria on the path of achieving her net zero by 2060 ambition. That's our show for the week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.